stood in front of the busted up walls, amazed by all I never knew was behind them. There were wires, pipes, support beams, insulation, and it all stood out so vulnerable and exposed. I ran my hand along the rough reality of renovation and thought how very similar my heart felt at that very moment. The only difference was I knew my house would be put back together, better than ever. I just wasn't so sure about my heart. With the house, I knew a basic time frame. I also knew enough about renovations to add a few months to kind of buffer the time to the completion date. Regardless, I absolutely knew there would be a beginning of this project and there would be an end to this project. I also knew that the end result would be beautiful. And since I knew the basic time frame and how beautiful things would eventually be, the busting up part of the renovation did not bother me. I was actually happy that the demolition occurred. It was not a sign of irreparable problems. It was a sign of intentional progress. But I couldn't say the same thing about the busted up places of my heart. Not now, not yet. When I stood and looked in the mirror, my demolished heart was not as easy to see as those walls, pipes, wires, and insulation. But the brokenness certainly revealed things. Inside my heart, it revealed fear, anxiety, shock, trauma, and distrust. Distrust, there it was, the biggest of all the issues that resided beneath the surface. The ripping open and exposing of my heart. It had certainly revealed something that I needed to see but did not dare want to admit. About me, about God, about my utter lack of trust in Him. Now don't get me wrong, you know I'm a Jesus girl through and through. I love studying His Word, doing the right and required things, following Him and fulfilling my calling. Yes, yes, sign me up for all of that. But when God starts to deviate from the plan I'm assuming that my life should follow, I'm much more apt to want to tame God, not trust Him. And when a busting up of all that I felt was safe and secure happens without any assurance of a completion date or a vision of the exact good that will surely come from this, well, that is when I slide my hand down and I quit volunteering so eagerly to follow hard after God. That's when I kick into high gear, resisting God's plans, making suggestions of how to do this whole thing better, and I start pulling away from trusting God. I press into my ways, my timing, and my assumed better plan. I demand that the builder hand over the tools, and though I have no clue how to truly make things better, I start patching and covering and frantically fixing a hodgepodge repair that will be disappointing at best, detrimental at worst. You know, I can see this so clearly in my house renovations. And I have no desire at all to displace the master builder there. I just wish I could have the same clarity in my trust of God. And I guess at the risk of exposing too much of my own flesh tendencies, I'm going to pull back a protective layer of my soul. I want to trust God, and I'm good with declaring my trust of Him. But declaring faith is not the same thing as walking out an absolute dependence on God to be God. That's where I want to build altars of my own solutions. That's where I want to run and fix things my way rather than fixing my eyes on the Lord and actually trusting Him. In both cases, I'm worshiping, but worshiping my desires over worshiping God Himself is an altar that does not honor God. Actually, quite the opposite. In biblical times, there were patterns around God's people building high places, which were tangible places to worship, false gods and idols. It's not the physical location that was the issue, it's what they represented. The high places came to represent the idol worship itself. For example, Baal was the false god of the storm or rain. People wanted assurance of rain so that their crops would do well and that they would have food and continue to live. So you can imagine how fearful they might have been to tear down the high place of Baal, because what if it caused a famine? Their crops would fail, they'd have no food, and then they would surely die. It was a vicious cycle, turning to things that would always fail them, but hoping they'd be faithful. But in reality, all of those high places, those false gods, they were just a solution of their own making. It was just a way for them to try to maintain control. They looked over and they saw what the Canaanites were supposedly doing, and they were thriving. So they worshiped Baal. Maybe we should too, the Israelites thought. It was easier for them to worship something they could see rather than something they couldn't see. Worshiping at the high places at first can seem like something foolish those people did. But what I just described that I do, worship solutions and plans of my own making, it makes all of this very personal. It's not just an issue to study about them. It's a significant spiritual erosion that must be addressed in my soul. Not one day, but today. It's the very thing that distracts and deters me from truly trusting our trustworthy God. But understand, addressing this isn't because God is disappointed in me. He's actually appointing this time for me to understand the depth of His love and His ability to provide for me like never before. That's why I cannot think of two more perfect books of the Bible to dust off and dig into than 1st and 2nd Kings. What appears from the outside as ancient text about long ago leaders with faulty hearts isn't so far removed from addressing the exact issues I need to examine in my own life. As I've dared to read these books from the vantage point of needing those truth treasures buried inside of them, I've been astonished at how much application there is for this girl who loves God, but finds herself resisting Him in ways that are more dangerous, probably more dangerous than I've ever cared to admit before. And I wonder why I find myself so very exhausted and anxious and heavy burdened. All of that happening on the inside, while outside I'm singing and quoting verses about the abundant Christian life. I guess you could say there's a disconnect somewhere between really living the faith I want and the one I'm actually living. Maybe you felt it too. I've seen it in your tear-filled eyes. I've heard it in your questions around the harder things to understand about God. And I'm so thankful that we're going to do this study together. I'll be honest, there's a lot we need to get through to uncover the ultimate lessons from the Kings. Your brain could start to wonder, why am I even studying this? It seems like there's just one bad decision after another with these kings. Even some of the really good kings we'll study that show so much promise, well, they're going to disappoint us too. But I really believe what we're going to learn is going to help us process through the hard realities we're facing and lead us to a deeper trust in our God, who is powerful to save, who does hear our cries for help, and who is the deliverer we can count on. I'm standing here in the Holy Land today, and what I'm overlooking is the city of Shechem, surrounded by so many significant scriptural landmarks. But what I particularly want to draw your attention to here in Shechem is Mount Gerizim, also known as the Mountain of Blessings, and Mount Ebal, also known as the Mountain of Curses. This came from the direction Moses gave in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. Then Joshua carried out the instruction of Moses when the people of Israel arrived in the Promised Land. You can find that in Joshua 8, 30 through 35. There were 6 tribes on Mount Gerizim that spoke out blessings as long as the people obeyed the covenant. Then the 6 tribes on Mount Ebal spoke curses if the people disobeyed the covenant. This was one of the very first events that took place when the children of Israel entered the Promised Land to settle in their hearts the importance of wholeheartedly following after God. Israel was a unique nation, a theocracy led by God Himself. They experienced God leading them through the desert into the land they could now call home. This exercise of calling out the blessings of trusting and following God, and then also the curses that would be experienced if they turned away from God, was so significant to this day. My Hebrew guide told me that lots of people live on Mount Gerizim, the blessings, but Mount Ebal, it's a desolate place, even to this day. Studying 1st and 2nd Kings is not just important because they're 2 books of the Bible, but also because we get to see what happens to God's people when they demand to be led by human kings and not just God himself. They didn't want to look different than the other nations around them. They wanted a king they could see with their own eyes. They hoped a visible king would intimidate other countries and instill fear in them that would protect Israel from possible attacks. So as we dive into our study of 1st and 2nd Kings, I want to address some foundational questions I'm sure many of us have. How did we get here? How did the Israelites go from being a people led by God to a people being led by earthly kings? So let's look at a historical timeline to see where the long reign of kings began. God's people have a history of being in captivity, and then God rescuing them and bringing them into freedom. But God's people also have a history of sacrificing that freedom on the altar of their own misplaced desires, lack of faithfulness, and distrust of God's plan in the face of hardships. So they made choices in disobedience that take them back to captivity, and the cycle of needing God's rescue will start all over again. This is the repetitive history of the Israelites, starting with Jacob, the father of the 12 sons who eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob loved his son Joseph more than his older brothers. Genesis 37:4 says, "When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Their jealousy drove them to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who took him as a slave to be sold in Egypt." God was with Joseph, and even though he was still in captivity in Potiphar's house and then in an Egyptian prison, eventually, Joseph interpreted a dream for Pharaoh, and he was not only freed from prison, but elevated to the second most powerful man in the kingdom. When famine hit the land, Joseph's brothers came from Israel to Egypt looking for food, and Joseph made the difficult decision to forgive them and provide for them. Eventually, all the brothers moved to Egypt and multiplied to form the entire nation of Israel, a fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham about his descendants. Generations later, a Pharaoh came into the picture who did not remember Joseph and therefore didn't remember the good Joseph did. He was threatened by the massive numbers of Israelites in Egypt and enslaved them to maintain control. God heard the cries of the enslaved Israelites and raised up a deliverer. The first deliverer, Moses, is a shadow of the true deliverer and final deliverer, Jesus. Moses came from the tribe of Levi. His brother Aaron became the first priest of the nation of Israel. After God rescued and delivered the Israelites from slavery through Moses, they wandered on their way to Canaan, the promised land. God sent his law to the people through Moses, commanding them to live holy lives, worthy of the people of the one true holy God. The people instead made idols and complained to Moses. Anger and distrust got the best of Moses, and he sinned against God. He was not able to enter the promised land as a consequence of his sin. Joshua, who was second in command to Moses, led the people into the promised land. He served as the general commander of the Israelites and was the last leader of Israel before the period of Judges. While they still had elders, they looked to Joshua as their leader, their spokesperson, to help lead them in the direction God wanted them to go. After Joshua's death, the first generation of elders and rulers did exactly as Joshua commanded in Joshua 24, to follow after God and not turn away from him. However, the next generations began to do exactly what Joshua warned them not to do. They intermarried with the people in the land. They looked to pagan gods. They distrusted the one true God and disobeyed God's law. They began to desire a human king. Because the people of Israel were disobeying God, they were suffering the exact consequences Joshua warned them about. They were losing battles, they were fearful of losing their place of power and losing the land God promised and provided for them. In this time of disrepair for the people, God raised up judges as representatives of his rule and reign in Israel. The judges were the defenders of Israel to lead them out of their trouble. And even this was not good enough for Israel. Eventually, they cried out for what they saw other nations had, a human king. It's a solution of their own making. It's what they demanded from God, despite Him making it clear that a human king would not free them, but rather enslave them. A human king would not bring the redemption they longed for. In the short term, it might be comforting, but in the long term, a human king would bring on them the crushing weight God never wanted for His people. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done. From the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war, and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." And when Samuel heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Obey their voice and make them a king." Samuel then said to the men of Israel, "Go, every man to his city." Shocking, soul-shaking, stunning in the worst way. God's people rejecting Him and His perfect provision for solutions of their own making. But I can't shake my finger at the people of Israel, because though my demands are different, I want what I want too. I look around at what others have and make assumptions that having those things would make my life better than what God is currently providing. You know, the enemy ultimately wants us to be enslaved, and there's no better way than having us want our solutions more than God's best provision. For example, if you're single and you feel lonely, maybe a solution of your own making might be the thought, if I were married, I wouldn't feel so lonely. Even though my friends and family have raised red flags about this person, I need to get married, and I make justifications because I want what I want. Or, like with social media, the need for significance and all of that, it's never going to be satisfied, because followers today unfollow tomorrow. Your self-worth sometimes rises and falls on the fickleness of other people and whether or not they want to follow you, whether they leave nice comments or mean comments. It all just makes us feel more fragile, not more secure. Or here's another one. If only I had a best friend, it would give me a deep sense of belonging. You pursue that sense of belonging with everything you have. Taken to an extreme, though, your sense of well-being starts to rise and fall on whether or not they have time for you or even agree with your life decisions. I misunderstand what I truly need, and I start to formulate a life of my own making. I don't know what I don't know. I make assumptions that good things that I want are surely good for me and good for me right now. I say I trust God, but I don't trust Him to be God in this situation, in this desire of mine, in this assumption that I have that God isn't providing, so I'll just provide for myself. It's important for us to see this thread of distrust as a consistent theme from the Old Testament through the New Testament. Remember what we have learned so far about Israel choosing an earthly king over the divine King of heaven. One of the most specific and tragic examples of this is in the rejection of Jesus for the release of Barabbas. In the New Testament, we find the story of Barabbas and Jesus, and it's in all 4 Gospels. It's important to learn what we can about Barabbas in order to identify those possible motivations for this devastating choice. We know that Barabbas is one of those among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection. And I guess in my mind, I've always thought of Barabbas being a really bad guy to the people. But actually, because Barabbas, he would go and steal from some of the wealthy people, and his plan was really to disrupt the Roman authorities, the crowds liked him. They had a favorable opinion of a man like Barabbas. They didn't just talk about fighting for what they believed in, they were living it out. So while we know the reason for the release of Barabbas started with the instigation and the prompting of the chief priest and elders, it's also very likely the crowds would rather choose Barabbas because he represented and was actively involved in their agenda of freedom from the Roman oppression. I think Charles Spurgeon captures the complexity and simplicity of the issue as he taught that the people misunderstood Jesus' ultimate purpose. While they were drawn to Barabbas because he was trying to fill an immediate need of overthrowing Roman oppression, Jesus acts out of a purpose of eternal good for humanity. Spurgeon says his whole intent evidently was their good. His people reject him for an immediate good they were desperate for. I imagine some of the thoughts the crowd was feeling would be thoughts that maybe I'd be feeling. No, give us a king. Jesus isn't fighting against the Romans for us, so how could he truly be trustworthy? No, give us Barabbas. At least he fought for our benefit in the past. He must be more trustworthy. No, give us the solution we have created in the timing we want. However, the people's thought process was broken and in need of reorientation towards the truth of God. We need to remember the words of the psalmist in Psalm 111:7. The works of his hands are faithful and just. All his precepts are trustworthy. One of the most helpful passages in all of Scripture is found all the way at the end of our Bible in the book of Revelation. Let's look at Revelation 21:5. And he who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." Also, he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." We can look to what will be to give us faith in the trustworthy nature of God in the middle of our right now. Oh, friends, in this study, I really want to create a safe place to acknowledge that sometimes we too distrust God. And I want us to discover how God will give us relief for our places of unbelief. Together, we're going to find a more grounded faith, beautifully renovated hearts, and a strengthened trust in God like never before.